Band starten.
Hello again everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are of course going to be taking a look at the FlyingIron Simulations BF-109G6. The aircraft was recently released for Microsoft Flight Simulator, and FlyingIron Simulations were once again kind enough to reach out asking whether or not I would like to take a look. As ever, I was only too happy to do so of course today we're going to be taking the aircraft for a spin, reviewing the BF-109 as we go. We're currently on the ground at Tannheim Aerodrome, located on the southern borders of Germany, and up until 2013, Tannheim was the home of Tannkosh, an annual aviation meeting. At the time, Tannkosh was the closest European equivalent to the AirVenture Oshkosh Air Show, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. So we're going to relive a little bit of the Tannkosh magic today. We'll put the BF-109 through its paces in a small aerial display, and of course we'll be discussing my thoughts on the product as we go. Towards the end of the video, we'll finish up covering just a few more features of the 109, and then as always I'll finally conclude with my overall thoughts on the product. As always, I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you do, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. So welcome then to another absolutely superb cockpit from FlyingIron Simulations. This time of course it is the Messerschmitt BF-109, and as ever the modelling detail is absolutely meticulous, another really nice effort from the team. I will say that the texturing perhaps looks just ever so slightly less photorealistic than some of their previous efforts. We do have that slightly more painted effect overall. That may be as well something to do though with the materials of the Messerschmitt. Nevertheless though, I really like the cockpit of the aircraft, and indeed I really like the aircraft in general. I think it's one of FlyingIron's best efforts, and for sure one of the best warbirds currently available in the sim. Obviously the aim is to demonstrate that today here at Tannheim, so with that in mind, running through the before start checks. Firstly, we'll close up the canopy, and just making sure that is closed and locked. We'll set the brakes, throttle, we'll open 1 inch. Prop control is set to auto, the switch there in the aft position. Radiator control is set through to open. Battery master is selected on. Generator circuit breaker is selected in, and we'll do the same for the prop circuit breaker, as well as the starter ignition and the starter inertia systems. The engine start itself, engine stop is selected off. We'll prime the engine 7 times. You'll notice really nice sounds throughout the cockpit overall. I have to say I think this is probably one of the best soundscapes as well created by FlyingIron to date, particularly when it comes to the DB605 engine, as you'll hear in just a moment's time. So the engine is primed, no need for the winter start pull-out. Fuel pump circuit breaker is selected in. We'll set the fuel valves through to both, and we'll set the magnetos through to both. Really nice detailing there as well. You'll notice that the instrument panel there actually moving as we select the mags through. Again, a really nice little touch. So mags are set to both, checking the prop area. Looks to be clear. We'll signal to our ground crew that we're about to start. So holding the inertial starter. You want to hold that down for around 20 seconds. Once more, really nice sound effects as that flywheel spools up. And you're about to hear as well what I think is one of the best engine sounds in the sim to date. Certainly one of the best warbirds. Again, that DB605 sounds absolutely exquisite as it fires up. So we should be all good there now on the flywheel. Let's pull that starter. Okay, so we do have a good start, and once again the startup sequence of that Daimler-Benz 605 is pretty epic. Anyway, the engine gurgling away nicely now, but we'll just come up slightly on the throttle, let things tick over at 1000 RPM. terms of the after start checks, the remaining circuit breakers can go in. And one last quick look over the panel there, everything is set. For the oil pressure, we're looking for between 6 and 8 kilograms per centimetre squared on a cold engine. We've given things a little bit of time now to warm up, and we're currently up at around 2.2 kilograms per centimetre squared. Not sure whether or not that's a little bit low, perhaps. In terms of the fuel pressure, we're looking for 1.2 kilograms per centimetre squared up at 1,000 RPM. And currently we're up at around 1.7, 1.8. For the fuel valves, we'll test those, make sure the engine's operating correctly on both valves. So firstly through to the front fuel valve, and through to the rear, and back through to both. The radiator control, again, we'll test all 3 modes, so through to the closed position, through to the auto position, and for ground operations we'll come back through to open. The altimeter is set, we've got a QNH there of 1016. You can see we are up at some elevation today. We'll test the mags, so coming through to 2300 RPM, all the way back on the stick. One issue I have had with the aircraft, it will tend to jump around a little bit sometimes at high power settings. So we may need to counteract that with a bit of rudder. We'll see how we go. So there's our 2300 RPM. And you can see there the RPM actually continuing to climb. I think that's as a result of burning off some fouling there that's built up on the spark plugs. That is modelled on the aircraft, and very nicely as well, I have to say. So once again coming back to 2300, we'll test the magnetos. So firstly onto mag 2. Get a nice little jump there from the panel with the selection. Dropping about 50 RPM, max RPM drop we're looking for is 70 RPM. We'll come back through to both. And now onto mag 1. And same drop there on mag 1, around 50 RPM. So we can come back through to both. Temperatures and pressures still looking good. That oil pressure's come up quite nicely now, up to around 5 kilograms per centimetre squared. Just briefly coming up to around 2600 RPM. So power looking good. You can see the aircraft just wanting to jump out to the left there, so correcting that with the rudder. We should see 1.3 atmospheres there on the manifold pressure. We're showing about 1.26. And again, that's probably as a result of the aerodrome elevation. So bring the throttle back down to 1000 RPM. We should really have cleared out any spark plug fouling there with our high power setting, but nevertheless, once we've got ourselves back down at 1000 RPM, we'll just make sure we'll pull the anti-foul lever. And I believe that actually retards the ignition timing on the engine to burn off any spark plug fouling. There's no mixture lever in the BF-109, so the engineers came up with an alternative method to prevent spark plug fouling. Very clever. Anyway, that should have cleared the engine for now. For the taxi, we'll come through to manual on the prop pitch. And we need to set that through to the 12 o'clock position. Just come back slightly here on the throttle. There's 12 o'clock, so prop is set. Tail wheel we can set through to loose. And back off the throttle. Brakes can come off. And we can make our way out towards the runway. Okay, so we've got ourselves lined up here on the westerly runway at Tannheim, just running through our before takeoff checks. Set the flaps through to 20. And once again, very nice animations down there on the flap linkages. Stabilizer needs to go through to +1, which rather counterintuitively is actually a nose down trim input, it seems. So stabilizer is set, tail wheel is set through to the tight position. Prop control is set through to auto, radiator control again set auto, and once again just making sure we clear any plug fouling here, so we'll pull the plug fouling lever for around 10 seconds or so. And you can hear the engine there with that change in the ignition timing, coughing and spluttering a little bit. Again, really nice modelling, excellent sounds. Anyway, the engine should be clear now. For the takeoff, it's a pretty interesting ride in the BF-109. I've seen a bit of discussion about the best technique. Personally, I find full aileron out to the right actually works best, and initially as well using full rudder out to the right. It's off the brakes. Start feeding in the throttle, coming up to 1.3 atmospheres for the takeoff. The rudder, obviously the input there you can start to reduce as you build up speed, but the aileron input I keep in pretty much until you start coming back on the stick. Otherwise the 109 definitely has a bit of a tendency to drop the wing. So you can see there the rudder input just easing off now. Still got full right aileron currently, looking to rotate at 170 kilometers an hour. Just easing off on that aileron input. And back on the stick, and we're airborne. As soon as we have positive climb, take the gear up and up through 200 kilometers an hour now, so we can take the flaps up as well. Having seen some real world footage of the 109, there's a lot of movement and manual effort going on to get those flaps in. We'll keep 1.3 atmospheres for now, the manifold pressure. And confirming we do have the gear up, flaps are in. So we're just going to come straight back around into a left-hand downwind. First things first, we're going to make a fly past to the field and we'll go for a barrel roll overhead the runway. Just come back to 1.1 atmospheres as we make our downwind. We can start trimming out the aircraft here as well. Needing quite a bit of aft elevator trim now to get ourselves straight and level. The aircraft also a little bit left wing heavy currently. There's no rudder or aileron trim available. There is via the tablet, but we'll talk more about that later on. The real world 109 just using a fixed trim tab, I believe. So back up to 1.3 inches, or rather 1.3 atmospheres. There's the airfield rolling in towards the runway. We'll stay just out to the right of the runway centerline for all of our manoeuvres here at Tannheim today. And we'll come over the runway low level. So speed good up through 500 kilometers an hour. Back on the stick. And rolling out to the left. And straight back round for another run. Got a little bit slow there in the roll midway through. Not too bad overall. It's not a manoeuvre I practice very often in the barrel roll. I tend to go with an aileron roll typically, as I'm sure many of you will have noticed during my reviews. That one probably warrants a little bit more practice at some point. I'm forever meaning actually to get a little bit more au fait with aerobatic manoeuvring, something I plan to cover in a later video. Anyway, this time we'll set up for a slow pass over the runway. So back to 0.8 atmospheres, bleeding off some speed here in the turn. Haven't even discussed the flight model yet, but the 109 is an absolute joy to fly. Really enjoying the aircraft in the sim. Obviously I review a lot of aircraft here on the channel, and unfortunately get pretty busy as a result, so it's pretty rare that I actually revisit add-ons once I've reviewed them. Not necessarily through any fault of the add-on, usually it's just a lack of free time. But certainly with the BF-109, I know this is going to be an add-on when I want to do some personal flying within the sim. I really love my warbeds in the sim, and I think this is probably the best one currently available for Microsoft Flight Simulator. And that's coming from a Brit who absolutely adores the Spitfire. So it does feel a little bit wrong enjoying the BF-109 quite so much, but nevertheless it is an excellent add-on.
Mit diesem Dreizylinder Stammmotor mit gerade mal 60 PS, Baujahr 1934 und als letztes der Nachbau des
Okay, so as you can see we've got another 109 here formatting on us for the rest of the display. Should be good fun. We'll come back up to 1.3 atmospheres now on the manifold pressure, and we'll break off to the right. We'll have the other guy tucking behind us. We'll come back in for another left pattern. We're going to make a loop this time over the flight line. So just pulling some G, sighting up the runway, and rolling out. We definitely want to build up a lot of energy for this particular manoeuvre. The 109 really doesn't like to handle at low speed. So all the way through to full power, that's about 1.4 atmospheres. Temperatures and pressures looking good. We've got about 250 litres left on board the aircraft in terms of our fuel state. And if we want a little bit more oomph, we can engage here as well the methanol water injection system. You can see that's going to bring us all the way up to around 1.7 atmospheres. Up to around 500 kilometres an hour currently. Wingman just off our 7 o'clock position. And again, we'll tuck back in behind him. Do somewhat of a wing over here as well, just to build a little bit of altitude as we come through the turn. So there's the other aircraft, and again we'll tuck in off his 7 o'clock position. So speed looking good, 400 kilometers an hour. There's the runway, we'll roll in. And I find the loop is a really tricky manoeuvre actually to pull off in the 109. Got to have plenty of energy in hand. Particularly coming over the top of the loop, the aircraft really wants to snap on you. So looking good in terms of speed, 600 kilometers an hour or just above. Over the flight line, back on the controls. The controls feel really heavy at these sorts of speeds, which is great. And as the speed drops off there, the controls starting to lighten up a little. So getting over the top of the loop here as quick as we can. We want to avoid extending those slats. And you can see the aircraft almost wanting to snap on us there. Over the top of the loop. And we'll come back through to 1.1 atmospheres. Wingman just off our 2 o'clock. Disengage the methanol water injection once again. So a little bit scrappy there as we came over the top again. I find the loop's actually a very tricky manoeuvre in the 109. Anyway, coming back in for one more run here. We'll come back in for a high-speed run down the runway, then we'll break off, come back for a landing. And once again, we'll build up some speed to do that. Approaching 200 litres now on the fuel, so still plenty of fuel here for the last of our manoeuvres. And a decent amount in reserve here for the landing. Number 2's in position. And once again, we'll take that methanol water injection. Don't know if you can hear it or not in the video, but there are actually sounds associated with that as well, which is really nice. So same as before really, just rolling in from initially a fairly high level run. Of course this time though we're just going to make a low pass over the runway. And hopefully in the flyby here you'll hear that lovely whine of the Daimler-Benz 605. I think I've only seen one 109 myself in reality at an airshow. Maybe I've seen a couple, but certainly the thing that most stuck out for me was the whine of the DB605. So down the runway here, doing about 600 knots there in the fly past. So braking off to the left once again, and we'll come back in for our landing.
Allerdings schon wesentlich moderner und als Tiefdecker ausführen. Und an der Nordkante winkend vorbei die Doppeldecker, auf dem die amerikanischen Streitkräfte bis in die 60er Jahre ausgebildet starten.
Okay, so we're back in the traffic pattern once again for another left-hand downwind, this time of course for a full stop landing. Our wingman can tuck in behind us, he can land once we've touched down. We'll start coming back off the throttle, reduce the speed, need to be back below 300 kilometers an hour here before we take the gear. And as we do so, once again we'll just check the spark plugs, make sure they're clear of any fouling for the approach. In the meantime we'll run through our downwind checks as well, so brakes are checked and off. Undercarriage will hold. Mixture we don't have. Just coming down below 300 kilometers an hour, so take the gear down. Same for the fuel pump, not fitting on board the aircraft. Fuel state, we have about 150 litres on board. We can take the flaps below 250. So we'll take flaps 20 initially. And just starting to feed in the throttle again now. I want to keep the speed up around 200 kilometers an hour for now. So again, about 150 litres on board the aircraft. Flight instruments are checked, harness is secure. Trying to sight up the runway here, not the easiest thing to do in the 109. There's the airfield just coming off the nose. And speed just starting to creep away again from us now, so we'll take full flap. Flying a little bit of a curved approach here, we're definitely going to have to side slip the aircraft as well. Final checks, pitch is automatic, undercarriage is down, flaps are set, the runway is clear, landing clearance has been received. Most warbirds, of course, not the easiest aircraft to land, but the 109, usually you at least have some visibility off the nose to the left and the right. The Germans, though, decided to put two whacking great machine guns there, so even off the nose, visibility very limited. Slightly high here on the speed currently, we want to be back at around 180 kilometers an hour as we come over the threshold. And I find the aircraft, much like during the takeoff, is a real handful here during the landing. So back off the throttle, holding her off, flaring a little bit high there, trying to finesse ourselves back down towards ground, floating a fair bit down the runway. There's touchdown, reasonably smooth. Must admit I'm tensing up slightly on the controls here. Coming back on the stick, starting to brake now, all the way back on the stick, and just feeding in a little bit of power here. I don't know how accurate it actually is, but if you leave the throttle all the way back at idle, the engine will actually cut out on the ground. Anyway, a landing I'm fairly happy with there overall. We'll vacate off to the left and we'll make our way back towards dispersal. So there you go, guys. I do hope you enjoyed our outing in the absolutely superb FlyingIron Simulations BF-109G. Once again, FlyingIron have pretty much knocked the ball out of the park with this one. The 109 is an absolute joy to fly and operate, and it looks pretty beautiful as well. As I mentioned during the introduction, we'll just cover off a few more brief points regarding the product, and then to conclude, I'll give you a more thorough breakdown of what I think of the add-on. So firstly, we'll run through a brief overview of the onboard tablet that is made available with the BF-109G. For those of you who are already familiar with FlyingIron Simulations and their products, the tablet will certainly look very familiar. Firstly, we have the checklist page, which of course provides you with all of the necessary checklists to operate the aircraft. Further to that, in terms of checklist options, we also have inbuilt checklists within the sim. The checklists are also available in the manual. Next, we have the V-Speeds page, which gives you all of the pertinent speeds for operating the BF-109 within its limits. So for example, we have gear and flap extension speeds, the stall speed of the aircraft. You can also see that down the bottom we have minimum speeds for carrying out various aerobatic manoeuvres. After that, we have the live data page, which, as the name would suggest, gives you a real-time readout of various parameters on the aircraft. So for example, here we can see things such as our current speed in terms of indicated airspeed, true airspeed, ground speed. We can also see more useful information. For example, we can see the current sim conditions in terms of the weather. We have a readout as well of our current engine parameters, our current aircraft configuration, as well as our fuel state. Lastly as well, we have what is essentially a mini flight computer showing us our current fuel flow and our range capability in terms of nautical miles, kilometers, and time. The stats page gives you a short-term historical readout of the aircraft's performance. So over a 10-minute period you can see, for example, the aircraft's current altitude, speed, climb rate, G-force. The 109, as with most other FlyingIron products, also comes with an autopilot, only available via the tablet. Not everyone's cup of tea, I'm sure, but it's still a really nice option to have, particularly if you want to make some longer flights in the aircraft. Obviously you can just take a little bit of the workload out of the process. The autopilot is pretty simplistic, it's just a very basic heading hold and out hold function. But nevertheless, it certainly gets the job done, and as I say, for a longer flight I think it's quite a useful function to have. Something that we've seen a little bit more recently from FlyingIron simulations is the workshop page of the tablet. These days the FlyingIron lineup does model basic wear and tear, and from the workshop page you can see the current state of your aircraft. So you can see here, for example, we've been flying the aircraft for a couple of hours now, so we're edging our way towards a 25-hour inspection. Similarly, we've depleted a little bit of our onboard oxygen supply, and the spark plug's just starting to wear down there slightly as well. If you run the aircraft too hard early on without giving the oil a chance to warm up, you'll see higher oil pressures, and as a result you may well blow an oil seal, the consequences of which are a loss of engine power, and you'll even see visual modelling of the oil over the canopy of the aircraft. And of course, once you have the aircraft in such a state, you'll probably have to make a forced landing, come back to the workshop, repair the aircraft, and try again. Lastly, the settings page, as the name would suggest, gives you the ability to configure various aspects of the 109G. So firstly, we have the option to switch out the onboard gun sight with a GPS. Not an option that I generally like to make use of myself, but again, as with the autopilot, certainly a nice option to have. We have the ability to switch out the original canopy design, which, as we discussed during the flight, is a little bit limited in terms of visibility. We can update the aircraft with an earlier designed canopy, which I gather was fitted to later models of the G6. We have the option to hide the pilot. That means via the external model you'll no longer see a pilot sat within the cockpit. We can also choose to hide the control column internally for ease of visibility, and finally you can choose to hide the prop disc. Presumably that would be an option that's beneficial to VR users. The G6 can also be fitted with a tropical filter, presumably for use in dustier climes. Not something that we featured here in today's video. As we discussed during the flight, the 109 can be a little bit of a handful on the ground. The aircraft is an absolute joy once airborne, but if you want things to be a little bit more simplistic, then as you can see we do have the option here for simplified ground handling. Next we have the option to add or remove the onboard weapons. There is visual modelling of the aircraft's guns and an associated weight penalty for carrying those. As always though, please do note that if you purchase the aircraft from the InSim marketplace, then no visible weapons will be available on the 109. We can also install within the cockpit a small radio transponder, useful if you do want to take the aircraft on VATSIM. And lastly, in terms of configuration options, we have the ability to replace the German language throughout the cockpit with English. In terms of realism settings, as we've discussed, the aircraft will suffer various states of stress and or failure. But of course you can choose whether or not you want that turned on or off, again dependent on how much you just want to enjoy the aircraft or simulate things a little bit more accurately. The tablet brightness option is fairly self-explanatory. We also have the ability to push the aircraft back. I haven't made use of that myself. The battery can be connected via the cockpit controls, but to disconnect it's actually usually a task carried out by the ground crew. So via the tablet here we have the ability to disconnect the battery once again. And lastly we have an aileron trim selection. I mentioned during the flight, as far as I'm aware, the BF-109 just has a fixed trim tab. Ordinarily that would of course be set on the ground to give the aircraft straight and level flight at a specific speed. Essentially that can be adjusted here via the tablet. It can however also be adjusted on the fly. It seems to work pretty well overall. My only real gripe there, it would be nice to have more granularity with the selection. Currently you can only select 5% increments, which I find occasionally doesn't lead to a completely straight and level aircraft. Just one more feature that we didn't touch on here, it is worth noting the gun sight is also operable in terms of a visual display of the gun sight itself. And the same with the ammunition counters, those are operable. However, definitely worth noting that the actual armaments on the aircraft are not operable, they are purely there for visual display. Anyway, that just about covers the features that we didn't get to look at during the flight. As usual, as I say, we'll just finish up with a conclusion. We'll run through all of the usual areas of the product and I'll give you my thoughts. So as far as the FlyingIron Simulations BF-109G goes, once again I think the aircraft is an absolute triumph from the team. We will start with just a few negative points that I found with the aircraft and then as usual we'll move on to the positives. We've already touched on the aileron trim tab via the tablet. It would be nice to have more granularity there with the selection, though obviously it's a pretty minor issue and a pretty easy fix. One thing that I was slightly disappointed to see with the aircraft, we no longer seem to have a period appropriate pilot model available. The default Asobo military pilot does an okay job at standing in within the sim, but certainly it would be great to have a period accurate World War II German fighter pilot model available. The texturing of the BF-109, generally pretty exemplary overall, both internally and externally. It did look to me though as though the prop blades were rather shiny. I don't know whether or not that's true to life of the aircraft, but to my mind it didn't look very photorealistic externally. And another small attention to detail, when sat on the tarmac you can see that the main wheels of the aircraft are ever so slightly off the ground. Similarly, at least when using the military pilot avatar, with certain throttle positions the pilot's arm actually clips slightly through the body of the airframe. So as I say, just one or two visual details that do need tweaking up, but I'm sure they'll be seen to. FlyingIron are one of the best developers in the sim when it comes to tweaking and adjusting, improving their product after release. Lastly, in terms of the texturing, and this very much comes down to a personal viewpoint. As I mentioned earlier on, whilst I think the cockpit texturing is absolutely excellent, there's a very high level of attention to detail. To my mind, the textures themselves don't look quite as photorealistic as we've seen on other FlyingIron Simulations products. Things do have that slightly more hand-painted feel overall, which is not my personal preference in terms of art design within the sim. Moving on to my positives, we'll start again with visuals. The visual modelling throughout the product, bar a very few small issues that we've already touched on, is exemplary. Externally the Gustav looks excellent, and internally I really like that all of the wires, all of the linkages, as usual, have been modelled in really exacting detail by FlyingIron. Texturing externally is right up there with the very best, and the same is certainly true internally. Again, it's just the art style feels slightly different to me from the previous FlyingIron products that we've seen. In terms of the aircraft sounds, I think those speak for themselves, but they are some of the best sounds that I've heard within Microsoft Flight Simulator thus far. Initially, I was actually somewhat skeptical of the sounds. The DB605 in the sim seems to have a very grunty, gurgly, almost agricultural feel to the engine. But having watched some real-world videos back, that certainly seems to be true to life, and both internally and externally, I think that FlyingIron Simulations have done an exemplary job with the sound set. Maybe just a little bit more supercharger whine during the flybys would have been nice. But that is of course really starting to nitpick. Overall the sounds are excellent, both the engine sounds, the cockpit sounds as well, the associated control sounds. There is a very high level of attention to detail there, and as with any decent sound set in the sim, it really ramps up the immersion of the product overall. The aircraft systems are also generally excellent. FlyingIron Simulations state that this is their most comprehensive product to date. The 109 has had more man hours from the team than any other product that they've put out so far. That's quite apparent to me, as the depth of the aircraft systems certainly seems to be more comprehensive than some of their previous products. As an avid fan of warbirds within the sim and FlyingIron Simulations work in general, it's really nice to see their work going from strength to strength. And what's even better still is, as we've seen with some of their other products, I'm sure these improvements will be carried across at a later date to aircraft like the Spitfire, like the Hellcat, the P-38. Not only are the aircraft systems pretty detailed, but it's nice to see as well that we do have basic failure modelling, basic wear and tear. One of the challenges of flying any warbird within the sim is engine management, and that certainly comes across with the 109. That being said, I think the 109 within the sim is still more resilient probably than the real-world aircraft. I spent a really good period of time outside of this video really trying to push the engine. I wasn't able to induce a complete failure at any point. But nevertheless, once again it is nice to see some concessions to failure modelling, and great as well to see that there is some associated visual modelling with that. Once again we saw the engine oil system there painting the contents of its oil over the canopy of our aircraft. One feature that would have been nice to see there with the forced landing There was no deformation there of the prop blades as we touched down, which you do see on many other products within the sim. As far as the aircraft model goes, as always it is a little bit trickier for me to judge this one, not having flown an aircraft of a similar type. Nevertheless, unequivocally I would say that the BF-109G is one of the better Warbird models within the sim to date in terms of the flight modelling. The aircraft is a complete handful during the takeoff and the landing, which I gather is true to life. I think potentially having to use full aileron deflection during the takeoff is somewhat unrealistic. And similarly, the aircraft does have that typically Microsoft Flight Simulator behaviour that you really have to get the input in before you start the takeoff, otherwise you get some slightly more strange, slightly more snappy behaviours in terms of the aircraft departing off the runway. Airborne, the 109 is an absolute joy to fly. Initially, I thought the climb rate seemed a little bit overzealous, but again, having watched back some real-world footage, that does seem to be true to life. Roll rate and control response feels pretty decent. At high speeds as well, the controls do feel really heavy, which I liked. Maybe even a touch too heavy. It's actually quite hard to get the aircraft through a loop without stalling out over the top. Particularly once you see that auto slat deployment, which is modelled very nicely as well, the aircraft will tend to snap a wing. So whether or not the 109's flight model is completely accurate, I can't say, but certainly the aircraft feels the part. A joy to fly at high speeds with high energy, but a bit of a dog at low speeds and whilst handling on the ground. Generally speaking, I like the amount of extra features as well that the product comes with. You saw there running through the options page of the onboard tablet, for example, we do have an onboard GPS should we want it. The same with the autopilot, the working gun sight, the ability to switch between German and English for the cockpit language options. All of those just flesh out the product a little bit more, make the product more usable to a wider audience. And lastly, just touching on the aircraft frame rate, once again FlyingIron Simulations have really managed to pull off a pretty immense effort here with a beautiful aircraft, having very little impact on the frame rates overall. I was getting 69 FPS in the 109G versus around 72 FPS in the default Cessna 152, so only dropping around 3 frames between the two aircraft. In summary then, I think that the BF-109G is another absolutely superb effort from the FlyingIron Simulations team. Just a few very minor niggles that need fixing up, but nothing that spoils the enjoyment of the aircraft overall. As I mentioned during the flight, I get very little opportunity these days to revisit an add-on, enjoy an add-on in my own personal time. But certainly the FlyingIron Simulations BF-109G will be right up there on my list if I have an hour to kill and want to have some fun within the sim. Anyway, once again a very big thank you to FlyingIron Simulations for letting us take a look at the aircraft. And thank you very much to all of you for watching. I do hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, then please consider giving it a like. If you want to see more content from the channel, then please consider subscribing as well. Lastly, if you would like to help support the channel, you can do so by becoming a channel member or patron. And a very big thank you, as always, to my channel members and patrons for all of your support. I do hope that all of you are having a great day, wherever you are. Take really good care, and I will see you all again soon.